Angelina Weld Grimke's From the Closing Door, read from the Portable Harlem Renaissance Reader, edited by David Levering Lewis. It was the mother heart of Agnes that had yearned over me, had pity upon me, loved me, and brought me to live in the only home I have ever known. I have cared for people. I care for Jim, but Agnes Milton is the only person I have ever really loved. I love her still. And before it was too late, I used to pray that in some way I might change places with her and go into that darkness where, though still living, one forgets sun and moon and stars and flowers and winds and love itself. And existence means dark, foul-smelling cages, hollow, clanging doors, hollow, monotonous days. But a month ago, when Jim and I went to see her, she had changed. She had receded, even from us. She seemed, how can I express it? Blank, empty, a gray automation, a mere shell. No soul looked out at us through those vacant eyes. We did not utter a word during our long journey homeward. Jim had unlocked the door before I spoke. "Jim," I said, "they may still have the poor husk of her cooped up there, but her soul, thank God, at least for that, is free at last." And Jim, I cannot tell of his face, never said a word, but turned away and went heavily down the stairs. And I went into Agnes Milton's flat and closed the door. You would have never dreamed it was the same place. For a long time I stood amid all the brightness and mockery of her sun-drenched rooms, and I prayed night and day. I have prayed since, the same prayer that God, if he knows any pity at all, may soon release the poor spent body of hers. I wish I might show you Agnes Milton of those far-off, happy days. She wasn't tall, and she wasn't short. She wasn't stout, and she wasn't thin. Her back was straight, and her head high. She was rather graceful, I thought. In coloring, she was Spanish or Italian. Her hair was not very long, but it was soft and silky and black. Her features were not too sharp. Her eyes clear and dark, a warm leaf brown, in fact. Her mouth was really beautiful. This doesn't give her, I find. It was the shining beauty and gaiety of her soul that lighted up her whole body and somehow made her, her. And she was generally smiling or chuckling, her eyes almost closed when she did so, and there was the two most delightful crinkles all about them. Under her left eye there was a small scar, a reminder of some childhood escapade that became, when she smiled, the most adorable of dimples. It was a Tuesday morning, about 4 months, maybe, after my first experience with the closing door. The bell rang 3 times, the postman's signal when he had left a letter. Agnes came to her feet, her eyes sparkling. "My letter from Bob," she said, and made for the door. She came back slowly, I noticed, and her face was a little pale and worried. She had an unopened and an unopened letter in her hand. "Well, what does Bob say?" I asked. This isn't from Bob," she said slowly. "It's only a bill." "Well, go ahead and open his letter," I said. There wasn't any, Lucy." "What?" I exclaimed. I was surprised. "No, I don't know what it means." "It will probably come in the second mail," I said. "It has, sometimes." "Yeah," she said, I thought, rather listlessly. "It didn't come in the second mail, nor in the third." "Agnes," I said, "there's some good explanation. It's not like Bob to fail you." "No. He's busy, or got a girl, maybe." She was a little jealous of him, and I hoped this last would rouse her, but it didn't. "Yeah, maybe that's it," she said without any life. "Well, I hope you're not going to let this interfere with your walk," I said. I I had thought, she began, but I cut her off. You promised Jim you'd go out every single day, I reminded her. All right, Agnes Milton's conscience, she said, smiling a little. I'll go then. She hadn't been gone 15 minutes when the electric bell began shrillingly continuously throughout the flat. Somehow, I knew it meant trouble. My mind immediately flew to Agnes. It took me a second or so to get myself together, and then I went to the tube. Well, I called. My voice sounded strange and high. A boy's voice answered. Lady here named, Mrs. James Milton? Yes, I managed to say. Telegram for yous. It wasn't Agnes after all. I drew a deep breath. Nothing else seemed to matter for a minute. Say, the voice called up from below. What the matter with you up there? Bring it up, I said at last. 3rd floor front. I opened the door and waited. The boy was taking his time and whistling as he came. Here, I called out as he reached our floor. It was inside his cap, and he had to take it off to give it to me. I saw him eyeing me rather curiously. You, Mrs. Milton? He asked. No, but this is her flat. I'll sign for it. She's out. Where do I sign? There, you have a pencil? With the door shut behind me again, I began to think out what I had better do. Jim was not to be home until late that night. Within 5 minutes, I had decided. I tore open the yellow envelope and read the message. It ran, Bob died suddenly. Under no circumstances come. Father. The rest of that day was a nightmare to me. I concealed the telegram in my waist. Agnes came home finally and was so alarmed at my appearance, I pleaded a frightful sick headache and went to bed. When Jim came home late that night, Agnes was asleep. I caught him in the hall and gave him the telegram. She had to be told, we decided, because a letter from Mississippi might come at any time. He broke it to her the next morning. We were all hard hit, but Agnes from that time on was a changed woman. Day after day dragged by, and the letter of explanation did not come. It was strange, to say the least. The Sunday afternoon following, we were all sitting after dinner in the little parlor. None of us had been saying much. And suddenly, Agnes said, Jim? Yes? Wasn't it strange that Father never said how or when Bob died? Would have made the telegram too long and expensive, perhaps, Jim replied. We were all thinking, in the pause that followed, the same thing, I dare say. Agnes's father was not poor, and it did seem he might have done that much. And why do you suppose I was not to come under any circumstances? And why don't they write? Just then, the bell rang, and there was no chance for a reply. Jim got up in his leisurely way and went to the tube. Agnes and I both listened, a little tensely, I remember. Yes, we heard Jim say, and then with spaces between, Joe? Joe who? I think you have made a mistake. No, I can't say that I do know anyone called Joe. What? Milton? Yes, that's my name. What? Oh, Joe Brooks. But Agnes waited for no more. She rushed by me into the hall. Jim, it's my brother, Joe. Look here. Are you Agnes's brother, Joe? Jim called quickly for him. Great Jehoshaphat, man, come up. What a mess I've made of this. For the first time, I saw Jim move quickly. Within a second, he was out of the flat and running down the stairs. Agnes followed to the stairhead and waited there. I went back into the little parlor, for I had followed her into the hall and sat down and waited. They all came in presently. Joe was older than Agnes, but looked very much like her. He was thin, his face really haggard and his hair quite gray. I found out afterward that he was in his early 30s but appeared much older. He was smiling, but the smile did not reach his eyes. They were strange, aloof eyes. They rested on you and yet seemed to see something beyond. You felt as though they had looked upon something that could never be forgotten. When he was not smiling, his face was grim, the chin firm and set. He was a man of very few words, I found. Agnes and Jim were both talking at once, and he answered them now and then in monosyllables. Agnes introduced us. He shook hands, I thought, in a rather perfunctory way, without saying anything, and we all sat down. We steered clear deliberately from the thoughts uppermost in our minds. We spoke of his journey, when he left Mississippi, the length of time it had taken him to come up, and the weather. Suddenly, Agnes jumped up. "Joe, aren't you famished?" "Well, I wouldn't mind a little something, Agnes," he answered, and then added, "I'm not as starved as I was traveling in the South, but I have a kind of hollow feeling." "What do you mean?" she asked. "Jim Crow cars," he answered laconically. "I'd forgotten," she said. "I've been away so long." He made no reply. "Aren't conditions any better at all?" she asked after a little while. "No, I can't say they are." None of us said anything. She stood there a minute or so, pulling away at the frill on her apron. She stopped suddenly, drew a long breath, and said, "I wish you all could move away, Joe, and come north." For 1 second, before he lowered his eyes, I saw a strange gleam in them. He seemed to be examining his shoes carefully from all angles. His jaw looked grimmer than ever, and I saw a flickering of the muscles in his cheeks. "That would be nice," he said at last, and then added, But we can't, Agnes." "I like my coffee strong, please." "Joe," she said, going to the door. "I'm sorry, I was forgetting." I rose at that. "Agnes, let me go. You stay here." She hesitated, but Joe spoke up. "No, Agnes, you go. I know you're cooking." You could have heard a pin drop for a minute. Jim looked so queer, and so did Agnes, for a second, and then she tried to laugh it off. "Don't mind Joe. He doesn't mean anything. He's always like that." And then she left us. Well, I was hurt. Joe made no attempt to apologize or anything. He even seemed to have forgotten me. Jim looked at me and smiled. His nice smile, but I was really hurt. I came to understand, however, later. Presently, Joe said, "About Agnes, we hadn't been told anything. Didn't she write about it?" "No. Wanted to surprise you, I guess." "How long?" Joe asked after a little. "Before?" "Yes. 4 months, I should say." That complicates matters some. I got up to leave. I was so evidently in the way. Joe looked up quietly and said, "Oh, don't go. It isn't necessary." I sat down again. "No, Lucy, stay," Jim added. "What do you mean, complicates?" Joe examined his shoes for several moments and then looked up suddenly. "Just where is Agnes?" "In the kitchen, I guess." Jim looked a trifle surprised. "Where is that?" "The other end of the flat, near the door." "She can't possibly hear anything then?" "No." "Well, then listen, Jim, and you. What's your name, Lucy? Well, Lucy then. Listen carefully, you two, to every single word I am going to say." He frowned a few moments at his shoes and then went on. "Bob went out fishing in the woods near his shack, spent the night there, slept in wet clothes. It had been raining all day. Came home, contracted double pneumonia, and died in 2 days' time. Have you that?" We both nodded. "That's the story we are going to tell Agnes." Jim had his mouth open to ask something when Agnes came in. She had very evidently not heard anything, however, for there was a little color in her face, and it was just a little happy again. "I've been thinking about you, Joe," she said. "What on earth are you getting so gray for?" "Gray!" he exclaimed. "Am I gray?" There was no doubt about it. His surprise was genuine. "Didn't you know?" She chuckled a little. It was the first time in days. "No, I didn't." She made him get up at that and drew him to the oval glass over the mantel. "Don't you ever look at yourself, Joe?" "Not much, that's the truth." I could see his face in the mirror from where I sat. His eyes widened a trifle, I saw, and then he turned away abruptly and sat down again. He made no comment. Agnes broke the rather little silence that followed. "Joe!" "Yes?" "Have you been sick or anything, have you?" "No. Why?" "You seem so much thinner. When I last saw you, you were almost stout." "That's some years ago, Agnes." "Yes, but one ought to get stouter, not thinner with age." Again I caught that strange gleam in his eyes before he lowered them. For a moment he sat perfectly still without answering. "You can put it down to hard work if you like, Agnes. Isn't that my coffee I smell boiling over?" "Oh, yes, I believe it is. I just ran in to tell you I'll be ready for you in about 10 minutes. She went out hastily, but took time to pull the portiere across the door. I thought it strange at the time and looked at Jim. He didn't seem to notice, however, but waited, I saw, until he had heard Agnes's heels tap going into the kitchen. "Now," he said, "what do you mean when you say that that's the story we're going to tell Agnes?" "Just that." "You mean," he paused, "that it isn't true?" "No, it isn't true." "Bob didn't die that way?" "No." I felt myself stiffening in my chair, and my two hands gripping the two arms of my chair tightly. I looked at Jim. I sensed the same tensioning in him. There was a long pause. Joe was examining his shoes again. The flickering in his cheeks I saw was more noticeable. And finally, Jim brought out just one word. "How?" "There was a little trouble?" he began, and then paused so long, Jim said, "You mean he was injured in some way?" Joe looked up suddenly at Jim at that, and then down again. But his expression, even that fleeting glance, set me to trembling all over. Jim, I saw, had been affected too. He sat stiffly, bent forward. He had been in the act of raising his cigarette to his lips, and his arm seemed as though frozen in midair. "Yeah," he said. "Injured." But the way in which he said injured made me tremble all the more. Again there was a pause, and again Jim broke it with his one word. "How?" "You don't read the papers, I see," Joe said. "Yes, I read them." "It was all in the papers." "I missed it then." "Yeah." It was quiet again for a little. "Have you ever lived in the South?" Joe asked. "No." "Nice civilized place, the South," Joe said. And again I found myself trembling violently. I had to fight with might and main to keep my teeth from chattering, and yet in it was not what he had said, but his tone again. "I hadn't so heard it described," Jim said after a little. "No? You didn't know, I suppose, that there is an unwritten law in the South that when a colored and a white person meet on the sidewalk, the colored person must get off into the street until the white one has passes?" "No, I hadn't heard of it." "Well, it's so. That was the little trouble." "You mean Bob refused to get off the sidewalk?" "Well?" "The white man pushed him off. Bob knocked him down. The white man attempted to teach the, quote, damn nigger a lesson." Again he paused. Well, the lesson didn't end properly. Bob all but killed him. It was so still in that room that although Jim was sitting across the room, I could hear his watch ticking distinctly in his vest pocket. I'd been holding my breath when I was forced to expel it. The sound was so loud they both turned quickly towards me, startled for a second. That would have been Bob. It was Jim speaking. Yes. I suppose it didn't end there. No. Go on, Joe. Even Jim's voice sounded strained and strange, and Joe went on. He never raised his voice, never lowered it. Throughout, his tone was entirely colorless, and yet as though it had been seared into my very soul, I remember word for word everything he said. An orderly mob in an orderly manner on a Sunday morning. I'm quoting the newspapers. Broke into the jail, took him out, slung him up to the limb of a tree, riddled his body with bullets, saturated it with coal oil, lighted a fire underneath him, gouged out his eyes with red-hot irons, burned him to a crisp, and then sold souvenirs of him, ears, fingers, toes. His teeth brought $5 each. He ceased for a moment. He's still hanging on that tree. We're not allowed to have even what is left. There was a roaring in my ears. I seemed to be a long way off. I was sinking into a horrible black vortex that seemed to be sucking me down. I opened my eyes and saw Jim dimly. His nostrils seemed to be two black, wide holes. His face was taut, every line set. I saw him draw a great, deep breath. The blackness sucked me down still deeper, and then suddenly I found myself on my feet, struggling against that hideous darkness, and I heard my own voice as from a great distance, calling out over and over and over again, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." They both came running to me, but I should have fainted the first and only time in my life, but that I heard suddenly above those strange noises in my ears a little choking, strangling sound. It revived me instantly. I broke from them and tried to get to the door. "Agnes, Agnes!" I called out. But they were before me. Jim tore the portiere aside, and they caught her just as she was falling. She lay unconscious for hours. When she did come to, she found all three of us about her bed. Her bewildered eyes went from Jim's face to mine and then to Joe's. They paused there. She frowned a little, and then we saw the whole thing slowly come back to her. She groaned and closed her eyes. Joe started to leave the room, but she opened her eyes quickly and indicated that he was not to go. He came back. Again, she closed her eyes. And then she began to grow restless. "Agnes," I asked, "is there anything you want?" She quieted a little under my voice. "No," she said. "No." Presently she opened her eyes again. They were very bright. She looked at each of us in turn a second time. Then she said, "I've had to live all this time to find out." "Find out what, Agnes?" It was Jim's voice. "Why I'm here, why I'm here." "Yes, of course." Jim spoke, oh so gently, humoring her. His hand was smoothing away the damp little curls about her forehead. "It's no use your making believe you understand. You don't." It was the first time I had ever heard her speak irritably to Jim. She moved her head away from his hand. His eyes were a little hurt, and he took his hand away. "No." His voice was as gentle as ever. "I don't understand, then." There was a pause, and then she said abruptly, "I'm an instrument." No one answered her. "That's all, an instrument." We merely watched her. One of the many. And then Jim, in his kindly, blundering way, made the second mistake. "Yes, Agnes," he said, "yes." But at that, she took even me by surprise. She sat up in bed suddenly, her eyes wild and staring, and before we could stop her, began beating her breast. "Agnes," I said, don't. "I shall," she said in a strange, high voice. Well, we let her alone. It would have been a struggle. And then, amid little sobbing breaths beating her breast the while, she began to cry out, "Yes, I, an instrument of reproduction, another of the many, a colored woman, doomed, cursed, put here, willing or unwilling, for what? To bring children here, men children, for the sport, the lust of possible orderly mobs who go about things in an orderly manner on Sunday mornings." "Agnes," I cried, "Agnes, your child will be born in the north. He need never go south." She had listened to me, at any rate. "Yes," she said, in the north. "And have there been no lynchings in the north?" I was silenced. "The north permits it, too," she cried. "The north is silent as well as the south." And then, as she sat there, her eyes became less wild but more terrible. They became the eyes of a seeress. When she spoke again, she spoke loudly, clearly, slowly. "There's a time coming, and soon, when no colored man, no colored woman, no colored child, born or unborn, will be safe in this country." "Oh, Agnes," I cried again. "Shh." She turned her terrible eyes upon me. "There is no more need for silence in this house. God has found us out." "Oh, Agnes." The tears were frankly running down my cheeks. "We must believe that God is very pitiful. We must. He will find a way." She waited a moment and said simply, "Will he?" "Yes, Agnes, yes." "I will believe you then. I will give him one more chance. Then, if he is not pitiful, But she did not finish. She fell back upon her pillows. She'd fainted again. Agnes did not die, nor did her child. She had kept her body clean and healthy. She was up and around again, but an Agnes that never smiled and never chuckled anymore. She was a gray, pathetic shadow of herself. She who had loved joy so much, cared more, it seemed, for solitude than anything else in the world. That was why, when Jim or I went looking for her, we found so often only the empty room and that imperceptible, slowly closing, opposite door. Joe went back to Mississippi, and not one of us ever again mentioned Bob's name. And Jim, poor Jim, I wish I could tell you of how beautiful he was those days, how he never complained, never was irritable, but was always so gentle, so full of understanding, that at times I had to go out of the room for fear he might see my tears. Only once I saw him when he thought himself alone. I had not known he was in his little den and entered it suddenly. I made no sound, luckily, and he had not heard me. He was sitting leaning far forward, his head between his hands. I stood there 5 minutes at least, but not once did I see him stir. I silently stole out and left him. It was a fortunate thing that Agnes had already done most of her sewing for the little expected stranger, for after Joe's visit, she never touched a thing. "Agnes," I said one day, not without fear and trepidation, "it is true. Isn't there something I can do?" "Do?" she repeated rather vaguely. "Yes, some sewing?" "Oh, sewing," she said. "No, I think not, Lucy." You've finished?" I persisted. "No." "Then," I began, "I hardly think we shall need any of them." And then she added, "I hope not." "Agnes!" I cried out, but she seemed to have forgotten me. Well, time passed as it always does, and on Sunday morning early, Agnes's child was born. He was a beautiful, very grave baby with her great dark eyes. As soon as they would let me, I went to her. She was lying very still and straight in the quiet, darkened room, her head turned on the pillow towards the walls. Her eyes were closed. "Agnes," I said in the barest whisper, "are you asleep?" "No," she said, and turned her head towards me and opened her eyes. I looked into her ravaged face. Agnes Milton had been down into hell and back again. Neither of us spoke for some time, and then she said, "Is he dead?" "Your child?" "Yes." "I should say not. He's a perfect darling and so good." No smile came into her face. It remained as expressionless as before. She paled a trifle more, I thought, if such a thing was possible. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Agnes!" I spoke sharply. I couldn't help it. But she closed her eyes and made no response. I sat a long time looking at her. She must have felt my gaze, for she slowly lifted her lids and looked at me. "Well," she said, "what is it, Lucy?" "Haven't you seen your child, Agnes?" "No." "Don't you wish to see it?" "No." Again, it was wrung out of me. Agnes, don't tell me you don't love it." For the first and only time, a spasm of pain went over her poor, pinched face. "Ah," she said, "that's it." And she closed her eyes, and her face was as expressionless as ever. I felt as if my heart were breaking. Again, she opened her eyes. "Tell me, Lucy," she began. "What, Agnes?" "Is he healthy?" "Yes." "Quite strong?" "Yes." "You think he will live then?" "Yes, Agnes." She closed her eyes once more. It was still very still within the room. Again she opened her eyes, and there was a strange expression in them now. "Lucy." "Yes." "You were wrong." "Wrong, Agnes?" "Yes." "How?" "You thought your God was pitiful." "Agnes, but I do believe it." After a long silence, she said very slowly, "He is not." This time, when she closed her eyes, she turned her head up slowly upon the pillow to the wall. I was dismissed. And again, Agnes did not die. Time passed, and again she was up and about the flat. There was a strange, stony stillness upon her now, and I did not like it. Did not like, though. If we only could have understood, Jim and I, what it meant. Her love for solitude now had become a passion, and Jim and I knew more and more that empty room and that silently, slowly closing door. She would have very little to do with her child. For some reason, I saw she was afraid of it. I was its mother. I did for it, cared for it, loved it. Twice only during these days I saw that stony stillness of hers broken. The first time was one night. The baby was fast asleep, and she had stolen in to look at him. When she thought no one would know, I wished to never see such a tortured, hungry face again. I was in the kitchen the second time when I heard a strange sounds coming from my room. I rushed to it, and there was Agnes kneeling at the foot of the little crib, her head upon the spread. Great, terrible racking sobs were tearing her. The baby was lying there, all eyes, and beginning to whimper a little. "Agnes, oh my dear, what is it?" The tears were still streaming down my cheeks. "Take him away! Take him away!" she gasped. He's been cooing and smiling and holding out his little arms to me. I can't stand it. I can't stand it. I took him away. That was the only time I ever saw Agnes Milton weep. The baby slept in my room. Agnes would not have him in hers. He was a restless little sleeper, and I had to get up several times during the night to see that he was properly covered. He was a noisy little sleeper as well. Many a night I have lain awake listening to the sound of his breathing. It's a lovely sound, a beautiful one, the breathing of a little baby in the dark. This night, I remember I had been up once and covered him over, and had fallen off to sleep for the second time, when, for I had heard absolutely no sound, I awoke suddenly. There was upon me an overwhelming, utterly paralyzing feeling not of fear, but of horror. I thought at first I must have been having a nightmare, but strangely, instead of diminishing, the longer I lay awake, the more it seemed to increase. It was a moonlit night, and the light came in through the open window in a broad, white, steady stream. A coldness seemed to settle all about my heart. What was the matter with me? I made a tremendous effort and sat up. Everything seemed peaceful and quiet enough. The moonlight cut the room in two. It was dark where I was, and dark beyond where the baby was. One brass knob at the foot of my bed shone brilliantly, I remember, in that bright stream, and the door that led into the hall stood out fully revealed. I looked at that door that led into the hall, and then my heart seemed suddenly to stop beating. I grew deathly cold. The door was closing slowly, imperceptibly, silently. Things were whirring around. I shut my eyes, and when I opened them again, the door was no longer moving. It had closed. What had Agnes Milton wanted in my room? And the more I asked myself that question, the deeper grew the horror. And then slowly, by degrees, I began to realize that there was something wrong within that room. Something terribly wrong, but what was it? I tried to get out of the bed, but I seemed unable to move. I strained my eyes, but I could see nothing, only that bright knob, that stream of light, that closed white door. I listened. It was quiet, very quiet, too quiet. But why too quiet? And then, as though there had been a blinding flash of lightning, I knew. The breathing wasn't there. Agnes Milton had taken a pillow off of my bed and smothered her child. One last word. Jim received word this morning. The door was finished closing for the last time. Agnes Milton is no more. God, I think. Maybe pitiful, after all.